Hi automotive enthusiasts, welcome to Octane Origins, where today we dive into one of the most fascinating machines ever to straddle the line between road and race, the Honda RC30. At first glance, it might look like just another sleek sport bike from the late 1980s, but behind that fairing is a story of ambition, innovation, and controversy that reshaped the very rules of motorcycle competition. The RC30 was never meant to be a mass-market product. It was a precision tool built by Honda to conquer the emerging World Superbike Championship. And conquer it did, but not without sparking backlash so fierce that regulators stepped in to stop it. So why was this motorcycle considered so unstoppable? And what made it different from everything else on the road at the time? Today, we'll unpack the cultural and technical forces that gave rise to the RC30, the wave of dominance it unleashed across racetracks, and the lasting impact it left, even after it was effectively outlawed from competition. Along the way, we'll explore how Honda's approach challenged the idea of what a production motorcycle should be, why the RC30 earned near mythical status among riders and collectors, and how it continues to echo through modern superbikes more than 3 decades later. Whether you've only heard whispers about this machine or you know it by reputation as the bike that rewrote the rulebook, this deep dive will give you the full picture. Over the next 25 minutes, we'll move from its creation in Honda's Skunk Works to its domination on the world stage, and finally to the legacy that ensures its name still carries weight today. Settle in, because the RC30 is more than just a motorcycle. It's a story of engineering brilliance, competitive tension, and the lasting question of how far a manufacturer should be allowed to go in pursuit of victory. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why the RC30 is remembered as the superbike so good they outlawed it. Honda's decision to create the RC30 began in an era when motorcycle racing was shifting from pure prototypes toward production-based competition. The new World Superbike Championship promised to be a battleground where bikes sold in showrooms would square off on track, and Honda saw an opportunity not just to participate, but to dominate. To do that, they needed something radically different from the typical motorcycles of the late 1980s. They needed a machine that could slip through the loopholes of homologation rules while still wearing a license plate. The RC30 emerged as that weapon, hand-built in limited numbers with engineering more at home in endurance racing than everyday riding. Its very existence raised the question, how far could a manufacturer push the definition of a production bike without breaking the spirit of the competition? Micro story. Inside Honda's Skunk Works. In the bowels of Honda's R&D facilities, a special team was given the task of creating a motorcycle that could guarantee race wins. They weren't chasing sales volume, so corners didn't need cutting. Titanium connecting rods replaced steel to reduce engine stress. Gear-driven cams ensured precise timing at high RPMs, and a single-sided swing arm allowed lightning-fast wheel changes during pit stops. While these details might sound purely mechanical, their impact was cultural. The RC30 was proof that Honda would spend whatever it took to merge racing tech with a road-legal form. For riders, owning one was like holding a slice of a factory racer. For rivals, it was a warning shot that Honda's resources were unmatched. Context digest. The homologation era. Racing rules of the time required manufacturers to produce a minimum number of road-legal versions of their race bikes, ensuring that what competed on Sunday could theoretically be bought on Monday. For most brands, that meant lightly tweaking existing models. Honda flipped the script. The RC30 was not a modified street bike. It was a race bike diluted just enough to meet paperwork requirements. This inversion of the process exposed how vague the rules really were, and it positioned Honda as a company willing to challenge conventions head-on. Micro story. Launching to the public. When Honda unveiled the RC30 in 1987, enthusiasts were stunned. The styling was clean, but beneath the bodywork was technology usually reserved for prototypes. Only a few thousand were built worldwide, each carrying a price tag that reflected its elite pedigree. Collectors and serious racers rushed to secure them, knowing the RC30 wasn't meant for casual commuting. For the average rider, it was aspirational, something glimpsed in magazines or on posters more than on city streets. Yet its mere availability blurred the line between everyday consumer product and pure competition machine. Reflection bridge. By turning a regulatory requirement into an opportunity, Honda revealed that the RC30 was less about following rules and more about redefining them. Micro story. Early race results. The RC30 didn't take long to prove its purpose. Riders who managed to get one found themselves with a decisive edge over competitors on conventional machines. In endurance races, its reliability and quick wheel change design meant teams could run faster, longer, and with fewer mechanical issues. On sprint tracks, the balance of its chassis allowed aggressive cornering without sacrificing stability. Each victory fed the legend, building momentum that made the bike not just a participant, but the benchmark of the series. Competitors scrambled to respond, often with limited budgets and outdated platforms. Context digest. Competitors. Under Siege, Yamaha, Suzuki, Kawasaki, and Ducati each had strong engineering teams. But few could justify creating a limited production exotic purely to win races. Honda's massive scale and deep pockets gave it freedom to gamble on a project like the RC30. For smaller manufacturers, this was a nightmare scenario. They faced the choice of watching Honda sweep titles or sinking resources into a gamble they might not survive. What was supposed to be a balanced competition quickly began tilting in one direction, and whispers about fairness started growing louder. Micro story. Racing legends in the saddle. The RC30 became the weapon of choice for some of the world's best riders. Men like Fred Merkel rode it to consecutive World Superbike titles, proving the concept worked at the highest level. National series across Europe and Japan saw similar stories unfold, with RC30s grabbing headlines and filling podiums. Fans cheered, but behind the scenes, tension grew. The more Honda dominated, the more rivals argued the bike wasn't really a fair representation of a production motorcycle. It was the loophole embodied in metal and carbon fiber. Reflection bridge. Honda had built more than just a winning machine. It had sparked a philosophical debate about what competition should truly represent. Context digest. The spectator's dilemma. For fans, the RC30 created a paradox. On one hand, it was thrilling to watch such a finely tuned machine obliterate lap records and showcase what engineering could achieve. On the other, races began feeling predictable. The sense of drama in sport comes from uncertainty, from the idea that anything could happen. If Honda's bike kept winning by default, the spectacle risked turning stale. Regulators and organizers couldn't ignore that dynamic forever, especially with rival brands pushing for intervention. Micro story. Collectability. Takes root. Away from the racetrack, the RC30 began acquiring a reputation as a crown jewel for enthusiasts. Limited production numbers, championship pedigree, and exotic engineering made it a must-have for serious collectors. Some owners barely rode them, preserving their bikes in pristine condition like fine art. Others treated them as weapons, using them in club races or spirited rides. This duality, part museum piece, part track destroyer, added to its mystique. Even at this early stage, it was clear the RC30 would never be just another vintage sport bike. Micro story. Local heroes and privateers. One overlooked aspect of the RC30's impact was how it empowered privateer racers. Normally, only factory-backed teams could access equipment close to prototype quality. With the RC30, skilled amateurs could walk into a dealership, buy a homologation special, and suddenly find themselves competitive at regional or even national levels. This democratization of elite tech was inspiring, but it also widened the gap between those who could afford the RC30 and those who could not. Fairness in racing was no longer just about rider skill. It was about access to this singular machine. Micro story. Pressure on organizers. As Honda's dominance solidified, governing bodies came under fire. Rival manufacturers lobbied for stricter definitions of what qualified as a production motorcycle, arguing that the RC30 violated the spirit of the rulebook. The debate wasn't simply technical, it was economic. If manufacturers concluded they couldn't compete without building exotic homologation specials, the championship could collapse under its own weight. Organizers faced a balancing act: reward innovation while keeping the field competitive. Every RC30 victory pushed them closer to a decision. Micro story. Cultural icon status. Beyond the technicalities and politics, the RC30 had already etched itself into popular culture. Motorcycle magazines ran glowing reviews, fans plastered posters on their walls, and trackside crowds marveled at its sound and speed. It became more than a machine. It was a symbol of what was possible when engineering was unshackled. For Honda, it was priceless branding. For rivals, it was a bitter reminder that the playing field was anything but level. This tension could not last forever, and the storm was about to break. The RC30's victories and the controversies they stirred set the stage for an inevitable confrontation between innovation and regulation, a clash that would define the next chapter in its extraordinary story. As the RC30's reputation grew, so did the outcry from those who felt the bike had turned the promise of fair competition into a stacked deck. Governing bodies, originally thrilled to have Honda's star power in their championship, found themselves under pressure from rival brands who claimed that the RC30 wasn't a true production motorcycle. The heart of the issue was simple. Was the RC30 a street bike adapted for racing, or was it a race bike disguised as a street machine? That question forced regulators to take a hard look at their own rules and decide how to preserve the integrity of the sport. Micro story: the Ducati challenge. While most manufacturers struggled to answer the RC30, Ducati made its stand with the 851, a machine that introduced fuel injection and 4-valve heads to their lineup. It was innovative, but the RC30 still had the upper hand. The contrast highlighted the financial and philosophical gulf between Honda's money-no-object approach and Ducati's more traditional engineering. Fans began to rally around the underdogs, hoping to see the Italian marque topple the Japanese juggernaut. The rivalry injected drama into the championship, but also amplified calls for reform. Context digest. The homologation spiral. The RC30's success sparked a dangerous trend. If Honda could build an exotic special to dominate, what would stop every manufacturer from following suit? Soon, whispers began about a future where racing grids would be filled with bikes so rare and expensive that ordinary enthusiasts would never see them in dealerships. This went against the very ethos of the series, which was supposed to connect fans to machines they could actually buy. Organizers realized that unless they drew a line, the championship could collapse into an arms race of unobtainable machines. Micro story: privateer frustrations. While some independent racers thrived with RC30s, many others found themselves priced out. A bike that cost as much as a small car was beyond reach for most, and second-hand units were quickly snapped up by well-funded teams. Grassroots competitors voiced frustration that the spirit of privateer racing was being eroded. The RC30 had democratized factory performance for a select few, but it had simultaneously widened the gap between those with resources and those without. That inequality was becoming impossible to ignore. Reflection bridge. What began as Honda's triumph was now threatening to undermine the very foundation of the sport it aimed to conquer. Micro story: behind the rule book. In smoky meeting rooms and late-night calls, racing officials debated the fate of the RC30. On one hand, it represented the pinnacle of what manufacturers could achieve under the existing rules. On the other, it was rewriting those rules by sheer force of excellence. Drafting new regulations wasn't just about slowing Honda down. It was about protecting the long-term health of the championship. The stakes were high. Alienate Honda and you risk losing the biggest name in motorcycling? Do nothing and you risk losing everyone else. Context digest. The economic undercurrent. Racing has always been about more than lap times. Sponsorship dollars, ticket sales, and television rights depend on unpredictable outcomes and competitive balance. If one brand swept every season with little resistance, the business side of the sport would suffer. Honda may have been winning races, but organizers recognized that a championship where fans already knew the ending wasn't sustainable. Economics and entertainment weighed just as heavily as technical fairness in the decision to act. Micro story: the ban arrives. Eventually, the hammer fell. Rule changes were introduced to prevent manufacturers from building such exotic homologation specials in the future. Displacement limits, production minimums, and tighter definitions of what constituted a road bike were put in place. The RC30 itself wasn't stripped of its victories, but its lineage was effectively cut short. Honda could not repeat the formula without major compromises, and rivals finally breathed easier knowing the playing field had been leveled. The outlawing of the RC30 wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a statement that the sport had to evolve to survive. Micro story: Honda's calculated response. To the surprise of many, Honda didn't withdraw in protest. Instead, the company pivoted, creating new models like the RC45 to work within the tightened framework. While these successors carried some of the DNA of the RC30, they were inherently more restricted, less exotic, and designed to comply rather than exploit. This demonstrated Honda's adaptability, but also confirmed that the RC30 was a one-time phenomenon, a perfect storm of engineering freedom and regulatory oversight that would never be repeated. Reflection bridge. The outlawing of the RC30 marked not just the end of an era, but the beginning of a lasting legacy. Microstory. Fans react worldwide. Enthusiasts were split. Some mourned the loss of a machine that had pushed technology forward, arguing that limiting innovation dulled the edge of the sport. Others celebrated the return of a more balanced playing field, where skill and strategy mattered more than access to an unobtainable bike. The debate spilled into magazines, motorcycle clubs, and paddock conversations. What everyone agreed on was that the RC30 had changed the landscape forever, forcing both fans and regulators to think more deeply about what racing should represent. Context Digest. Legacy of the homologation war. The RC30 was not the last exotic homologation special, but it set the precedent that regulators would never forget. Later bikes like Yamaha's OWS01 and Ducati's 916 were shaped by the lessons learned during the RC30 era. The pendulum swung back and forth between freedom and restriction, but the template of balancing innovation against accessibility was permanently established. Every modern superbike championship still wrestles with the balance first tested by the RC30. Microstory. From racetrack to collector's vault. As rulebooks moved on and racing adapted, the RC30 shifted roles. No longer just a tool for victory, it became a treasured artifact of a golden age. Collectors recognized its rarity and significance, driving values steadily upward. What once cost the price of a modest car now commanded six-figure sums at auctions. Each pristine RC30 preserved in a garage represented not just a motorcycle, but a frozen moment in history. A reminder of when one machine forced an entire sport to rethink itself. Microstory, the rider's perspective. For those lucky enough to ride one, the RC30 offered a visceral experience unlike anything else of its time. Its balance, responsiveness, and character weren't just about numbers on a spec sheet. They were about the feeling of absolute control. Riders spoke of its uncanny ability to inspire confidence, to translate every input into precise action. Even after the ban, even after more advanced machines arrived, the RC30 retained a magic that statistics couldn't explain. It was a machine that made you feel like a champion, regardless of the rulebook. The outlawing of the RC30 didn't erase its influence. Instead, it transformed the bike into legend status, setting the stage for how history would remember Honda's daring gamble. Once the RC30 was removed from the battlefield of active competition, its story didn't fade. It evolved. What began as a weapon of dominance became a symbol of what happens when engineering freedom meets regulatory boundaries. Collectors, riders, and manufacturers alike have spent decades reckoning with its impact. And the echoes of its brief but brilliant reign continue to shape the superbike world. Microstory. From race to road inspiration. Even though regulators clipped its wings, the RC30 influenced the design language of road bikes that followed. Honda's later VFR models, though more affordable and mass-produced, carried traces of the RC30's DNA in their V4 layouts and refined handling. Riders could feel a diluted but recognizable echo of the original, a reminder that sometimes innovation trickles down from the top. For many enthusiasts, riding those bikes was as close as they could get to experiencing the legend firsthand. Context Digest. Influence on modern. Superbikes. The lessons learned from the RC30 era continue to guide championship rulemaking and development today. Current homologation bikes like the Kawasaki ZX-10RR or the Ducati Panigale V4R exist within frameworks designed to prevent another RC30 scenario, yet they still owe their existence to the precedent it set. The balance between exotic performance and genuine production remains a live issue, proving that the RC30 didn't just leave behind nostalgia, it left behind an operating manual for the entire industry. Microstory. Auction block. Spotlight. Decades after production ended, RC30s began commanding staggering prices at auctions. Collectors recognized that owning one wasn't just about having a fast motorcycle, it was about holding a piece of racing history that would never be repeated. Stories of pristine, low-mileage examples selling for more than a new luxury car became common headlines. Each sale reinforced the machine's mythical status, making it as much an artifact as a vehicle. The RC30 had transitioned from outlaw to investment-grade legend. Reflection bridge. The more time passes, the clearer it becomes that the RC30's greatest victories happened not on track, but in memory, culture, and value. Microstory. The collector's dilemma. Enthusiasts who own an RC30 often face a difficult choice. Preserve it as a piece of art or ride it as it was meant to be ridden. Some choose to keep theirs in immaculate condition, displayed under soft lights and polished like jewelry. Others argue that the true spirit of the RC30 lives only when it's leaned hard into corners, revs climbing toward redline. This debate reflects the duality of the machine. It is both historical artifact and thrilling performance tool, and it's nearly impossible to treat it as just one or the other. Context digest, cultural memory beyond motorcycling. The RC30's story resonates even outside the motorcycle community. It often appears in conversations about design purity, regulatory limits, and the thin line between innovation and imbalance. Just as certain cars like the Porsche 959 or Ferrari F40 became symbols of pushing rules to the edge, the RC30 became motorcycling's version of that phenomenon. It represents an era when engineers stretched boundaries before institutions caught up. And that narrative appeals to anyone fascinated by the clash between creativity and control. Micro-story. Personal legends. Countless riders who owned or raced RC30s tell stories that border on myth. A club racer remembers overtaking machines that had no business losing. A collector recalls the awe of uncrating a brand new RC30 in the late 1980s. A fan recalls the sound of its V4 echoing through grandstands. These personal accounts amplify the legend, showing how the RC30 wasn't just a motorcycle but a memory maker. Each story adds another layer to its aura, keeping the machine alive in hearts and minds long after production ended. Micro-story. Lessons for Honda. Within Honda itself, the RC30 left a lasting mark. The company learned that innovation without restraint could achieve brilliance, but it could also provoke backlash. Later projects walked a tighter line, aiming to balance excellence with compliance. Yet deep within Honda's identity, the RC30 remains a point of pride, a time when the company showed what was possible when engineers were unleashed. It became a corporate legend as much as a cultural one. Reflection bridge. Looking back, the RC30 is not just remembered for what it did, but for what it forced everyone else to confront. Micro-story, enthusiast pilgrimages. Today, RC30s often appear at motorcycle festivals, concours events, and museum collections. Fans travel across continents to see them in person, taking photos, listening to the stories of original riders, and sometimes even catching a rare demonstration lap. These gatherings transform the machine into a touchstone of community, where enthusiasts bond over a shared reverence for a motorcycle that changed the sport. The RC30 has transcended its mechanical form to become a cultural ritual object. Context digest, legacy in perspective. Every era of racing has its icons, but the RC30 occupies a unique position because it represents both triumph and controversy. Unlike machines remembered only for their dominance, the RC30 is remembered for sparking reform. Its story contains the entire cycle: creation, conquest, outlawing, and immortalization. That arc gives it a narrative weight few other motorcycles can match, ensuring its place in the pantheon of motorsport legends. Micro-story, the timeless ride. For those rare few who still ride their RC30s today, the experience remains magical. Despite the passing decades, its chassis feels alive, its engine delivers character unmatched by modern machines, and its balance reminds riders why it once terrified competitors. Time has not dulled its charm. If anything, it has deepened appreciation for what Honda achieved when they built a bike that was simultaneously of its era and ahead of it. The RC30's final legacy is not in the trophies it won or the rules it broke, but in the way it continues to inspire conversations about the purpose of racing, the nature of innovation, and the enduring power of a machine to capture imagination. It began life as a weapon, became a controversy, and ended as a legend. A transformation that few motorcycles or machines of any kind will ever achieve. The Honda RC30 stands as proof that sometimes the most impactful machines are not the ones that last the longest, but the ones that burn brightest in a short span of time. It was engineered to dominate, and it did. It was outlawed because of that dominance, but instead of fading into obscurity, it transformed into legend. Today, its reputation is not built on how many laps it won, but on what those victories meant, and on the rules that changed because of them. When we trace the arc of the RC30, we see three intertwined forces: Honda's relentless drive to innovate, racing's need to preserve fairness, and the audience's hunger for a spectacle that feels both aspirational and accessible. Each of those forces clashed in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and the result was a motorcycle that continues to define what it means to push boundaries. For enthusiasts, the RC30 remains both dream and benchmark. To collectors, it is an investment, to riders, it is an experience, and to historians, it is a turning point. Its story resonates because it forces us to ask enduring questions. How much innovation is too much? When does dominance become detrimental? And can regulation coexist with progress? These are not just motorcycle questions. They are questions for every competitive arena where technology and human ambition intersect. That's why the RC30's legacy stretches far beyond the track, and why decades later it still sparks admiration, debate, and reverence. So when you hear the phrase, "the superbike so good they outlawed it," it's more than a catchy tagline. It's a reflection of the unique moment when engineering genius collided with the practical realities of sport. The RC30 is remembered not only for what it was, but for what it forced the entire motorcycle world to become. Its DNA lives on in modern machines, but its spirit, raw, uncompromising, and controversial, remains unmatched. Thanks for riding with us on Octane Origins. See you next time, automotive enthusiasts.